Okay, y'all, we have an alternate storyline again today. And this alternate storyline is about Gray Fullbuster being the main character. He's now the main protagonist of the anime fairy tale. So let's jump right into it. So most things happen the same way. Gray loses his family to Deliora. His father tries to protect him. He witnesses his father die. Um, like he sees his dad's body, right? But he don't see his mother's body. And then he moves on. He founds or she teaches him ice make magic. And he takes to it much easier than Leon does. Um Leon gets jealous, right? He gets jealous and he tries to go fight Deliora. He's like, I can prove that I'm better than or and you, Gray. I'll defeat Deliora. The ice shell technique is, starting to be used by Leon. Or comes in and saves Leon and Gray. Gray then finds himself, alone again, and he goes to Fairy Tale. Makarov invites him into the guild, and he becomes a member. During this time, he finds Natsu as well. Natsu and Gray still have that love-hate relationship. When Lucy joins the guild, he's just there. They fight against Irigor, right? In goddamn Eisenwald Guild. They get trapped inside of the train station. Urza wanted, Gray and Natsu to come with her. Of course, Lucy came with because she likes Natsu. Um, he freezes the wind, and they're like, "How did you freeze wind?" And he's like, "I just did. Now we gotta get out of here." Because Natsu still has his personality. Natsu goes after um, Mr. Irigor, right? And he fights against him, but this time he needs help from Gray. Gray actually defeats him, and Natsu's kind of pissed about it. But Natsu, Gray, and Urza take down Lullaby. We then get to Galuna Island. Um, they tried to help those people over there. Gray fights against Leon somewhere on the island. Natsu's fighting against Ultir, and then he fights against Deliora, or he plans on fighting against Deliora. You know, Leon doesn't like that, but Gray knocks his ass out. He's like, you got to fucking stop and you got to let that shit go. You know, that was our past. Yes, she died. But we have a future to live for, and you can't just, bring back an enemy that our master. She sacrificed her life so we could survive. You know, that ice is basically our master, or her body was used to create the ice shell. That's what that technique does. And Gray understands ice make magic way better than Leon ever would. You know, just like in the regular anime, but it's even more true now since he's the MC. Um, so now we get to past Galuna Island and we fight Phantom Lord Guild. Now, this is where, things get interesting. Gajil, fights or he destroys the guild hall. They go and Gray fights against Gajil first, but then he brushes him aside and he's like, Natsu, you handle this. And then Natsu's like, you don't tell me to handle this. I was already gonna fight the guy. You know how Natsu is. Um, Gray moves forward and he's trying to find Jose because he's like, Jose's the one. He's the one, running the show. I want to kick his ass. But then Makarov's like, no, Gray, you stay back. You can't handle, Master Jose. And he's like, I don't give a fuck. This guy's, played game with our guild. And he's like, no. And then during this time, Arya shows up, the wind mage who uses the poison. And he's like, and he knocks him out. So then it gets to the point where the element four come. He fights Juvia and Juvia turns, she likes Gray's dick. We know that. Now Natsu saves Lucy. He beats the element four fire guy. We'll say that. Well, you know what? We'll say that the Elfman shit happens the same way. Urza defeats Arya, with Gray's help, and then they move on to fight against Jose. Natsu fights against Gajil, and he has an extreme diff battle against Gajil. That still happens. All right, they're first gen Dragon Slayers. Keep that in mind. Now Gray is fighting against Urza, or Urza and Gray are fighting against Jose, and he's like, I wish I was a Dragon Slayer like Natsu, or I had like extra, or I was almost S class with like Urza, because if I was, then I could beat Jose. And she's like, don't stop fighting. The master can't fight, so we have to stand up and fight. And then Gray's like fighting, but then he's using his like more heavy hitting magic on them, and he can't fight. And then Makarov steps in, and Makarov does what he does. Then the Tower of Heaven incident happens. They take Urza, her old friends take her back to the tower. Ikaruga fights against Urza. Natsu fights against Fukuro and Vidaldis. He saves the girls from Vidaldis. And then Gray freezes him, and then he goes to fight against Jalal. Now, when he fights against Jalal, he's like getting his ass kicked at first, but then, Simon's like, he transports him. He's like, here, I'll embed this lacrima inside of you. And then, because Jalal's like, oh, Simon, you come to help me. And he's like, no, I'm embedding this ice dragon slaying lacrima into this ice mage. He'll be like more than capable of defeating you once he has ice dragon slaying magic. And he's like, what? How dare you betray me, you son of a bitch? Because he's still controlled by Old Tyr. And he's like, God damn it. That wasn't in our plans. And he's all pissed. And then he kills Simon. Gray goes the fuck off, and he just lays into him using ice make magic and mostly the dragon slaying magic. And now he's a second generation dragon slayer because he has a dragon slayer lacrima embedded in him from the ice dragon. Now Natsu's surprised, Gajil's surprised too. Like, now you guild has 3 dragon slayers, with Gray being one of them. Now Loxus comes back into the picture. He starts the Battle of Fairytale. The Battle of Fairytale kicks off. When the Battle of Fairytale kicks off, everything happens the same way, essentially, except Gray goes to fight. Gray fights against Freed a little bit because Juvia gets taken, and then he's like, don't worry about it, Elfman shows up, and he's like, you go stop Loxus. And he's like, you're a dragon slayer now, you should be able to like handle that shit. And he's like, okay. Then Mirajan takes care of Freed. Big Slow's taken care of by Lucy and Natsu. Natsu gets there after, Michigan and Urza do their thing. Natsu's trying to fight. Gray gets there too, and he's fighting. They're both fighting against Loxus. Gray's still new at using his magic, and Natsu has experience, but he's not as powerful as he is in the original story. So they're having problems. And then, Gajil comes to save Natsu because he's about to get hit. And then, Gray's not fast enough, so he's like, oh shit, Natsu. And then, Gajil shows up. They all 3 gang up on him. Boom, boom, boom. Loxus is still like that, though. And he's like, lightning dragon roar, and he hits all 3 of them, knocks them the fuck out. Gray hasn't even turned on the fucking ice dragon slaying magic yet, though. He uses fairy law, and then Natsu and Gray start fighting him. They go onto the roof, and Cardia Cathedral, and they're fighting. Natsu gets dismissed by some lightning, like a whole bunch of lightning dragon slaying magic, and he gets dismissed. And then Gray gets pissed, and he goes to fuck off using ice dragon slaying magic secret arts to defeat Loxus. But he's all fucked up after the fight. Loxus still gets his spell from the guild, and then they go on to the next fight, which is the Irration Sace. The Irration Sace revive Jalal, and Gray doesn't fight against Racer. Racer's fought only by Leon, and Leon has an extreme diff battle with him. Gray helps out a little bit, but then he goes to find other people. Um, Natu fights against. Natu fights against Cobra still, and he fights against Cobra and gets poisoned. Then Gray's trying to fight against Brain, you know, but then Jura's like, "Hey, step back, you're not, well equipped to fight this man, but I can defeat him." And then Jura, knocks his ass out. All the other fights go similarly, as in the original story. Then Zero appears. Zero comes through, and he's starting to like activate Nirvana. Um, we get to the point where Gray actually finds um, Route 1, and he finds Zero, and he's fighting against Zero. He's getting his ass whooped, though. And he's like, "You're not a true Dragon Slayer yet. I don't even know if your powers will awaken. You can barely use Ice Dragon Slayer magic." And he's like, "I'm getting the hang of it. I'll kill you with this magic." That kind of thing. Then Jalal hits him with some heavenly body magic, similar to the Flame of Rebuke, but it amplifies his ice magic. And he's like using golden ice. And he's like, "What the hell? This is, a new dragon slaying magic." And he's like, he's using ice to make magic and dragon slaying magic amplified by the, ice of rebuke. And he's like fucking this guy up. He tries to, do the same shit he did to Natsu, but Gray freezes that magic, and then it just disappears. He's like, "Oh my god," he froze it, and then it just disappeared. It broke. He shattered my magic to pieces. And then he just, takes care of Zero. He's done for, right? Now we're at Edelus. Edelus happens, right? So he fights in Edelus. It's Natsu, Wendy, and Gray, because they're Dragon Slayers. They're the ones who are still free. They free Lucy and fuck. They free Lucy and Urza. Urza fights against her copy. Gajil still fights against, Lily. But like, here's the thing, like, Gray is kind of upset, but then he's like, "You're first generation Dragon Slayers. I don't give a fuck about having a cat. I already have to deal with some bitch around, trying to find my dick, so it's all right." And then he fights against, Faust along with Natsu and Wendy and Gajia. And he uses a ice dragon slaying arrow to like shoot through and get Faust, and he's out. We get to Tenro Island, and his teammate's still Loki. When the time comes for Tenro Island, Natsu does find Gildarts, and he loses. And Zeref is still related to Natsu. In this, storyline, they're basically like neck and neck. Sometimes, Natsu fights better than Gray, and other times Gray fights better than Natsu. We'll say that. So basically, Zankro still fights against Natsu, and Natsu wins that fight. But Gray fights against Zoldio with Loki and defeats him. He tries to find other people to fight. He's trying to fight against Blue Note Stinger. Everybody else fights who they fight. Gajio fights. Gajio fights against Rusty Rose, and Evergreen and Elfman fight against the other two who aren't the Seven Kin. Gray, tries to find Blue Note Stinger, and then Gildarts comes to fight that fight. We get to the point where Ultir grabs up Zeref, and then, Gray's fighting against Ultir, and he's like, "Hey, your mama never hated you. She thought you were dead, and she legitimately thought you were dead. And when she took us in, it wasn't like she was replacing you, but she kind of, it might have looked that way. She then had to change her heart, and she, went and took Melody and left. Then they all fight against, and Gajio's in this group now. There's 6 members of Fairy Tail fighting. He gets up and he's like, "This shit's ridiculous, They all go there and fight. Lucy's not doing too much. She's offering support in the background, and Wendy is barely doing anything. It's just Gajio, Urza, Natsu, and Gray. They're all getting their ass whooped. Gray or Gajio and Natsu are the ones singled out because they're first generation Dragon Slayers. He's like a mere second generation that only has the Dragon Lacrima implanted in him. Is not somebody I'm concerned with. These Dragon Slayers could really pose an issue. So then Hades is trying to get rid of Natsu and Gajio. And then Loxus appears. Loxus fights against Hades, and he's, putting in the fucking work on him, right? Making him sweat a little bit. His powers actually still go to Natsu, though, because it just wouldn't make sense for them to go to Gray. Gray reawakens the, golden flames, though. Or not the golden flames, but the golden ice. And he's fighting against, Hades with Natsu before the devil's eye opens. And then when that happens, they're, struggling a little bit. Then Natsu and Gray use a, tandem attack, unison raid attack on Hades and gets rid of him, knocks him the fuck out. Arachnologia shows up and they can't do shit. 7 years pass and then the Grand Magic Games happen. Grand Magic Games start. We're getting to, territory that's, interesting. So Gray does still fight against Rufus. Or Gajio fights against Rufus first. He loses that fight. And he's upset. Now when it comes time to fight in the, against, Rogue and Sting, it's actually Gray and Natsu. And Gray and Natsu fight. Gray fights against Rogue and beats Rogue's ass, because he went through second origin training too, and he beats his ass. Natsu beats, Sting's ass, and they, beat him basically like mid to high dip, both of them. But they're holding back at first, so it looks like, oh shit, they might. And then they're like, no, we're gonna actually turn it on these guys. Let's not play games anymore. We let them get their hits in. Now let's finish this shit. And that's what happens. All right. Now we get to the part where team gets dissolved because Lucy's taken, so Natsu's looking for Lucy, and then Gray is looking for Rufus. I already beat that Dragon Slayer. Gajio's like, I want to beat that kid's ass too. So Gajio gets his chance to fight against Rogue, and he beats Rogue because Rogue did still look up to Gajio. He's like, I can't lose to 2 Dragon Slayers in one day, and Rogue he gets dismissed still. Gray beats Rufus low difficulty, and he's looking for Sting, and he fights against Sting. He just straight up fights Sting in this. Urza fights against Minerva and Kagura, and then Loxus fights against Jura. They win their bouts. Juvia beats Leon by herself. And then, Sting is a little bit more powerful than Rogue, but, he still gets the edge. It's like a high difficulty fight. And Gray wins it for him. Then, Future Rogue attacks, killing Lucy, so then Natsu wants to fight against Future Rogue. And, Gray is looking for Rogue. He's like, whatever. And, Natsu finds out about what happened with Rogue, and he's like, I can't let Gray die. Gray still ends up dying, though. Or he doesn't die. Leon steps in the way, and then, Gray's like, no! But Altair uses the Arc of Time magic and resets the world by 1 minute. All the Dragon Slayers fight against a dragon. There's an extra dragon there for Gray to fight against. And he's like, Natsu, you better beat that guy's ass or I'll have to step in. And he's like, don't worry, I'll win. he still has to help Natsu out a little bit. He shoots one of those dragon slaying arrows and helps Natsu beat Future Road. So now it's Tartaros. So during Tartaros, Gray gets another power up. This is when like Gray surpasses everybody in the guild essentially during this arc. So all the first generation Dragon Slayers had the dragons appear. Everybody fought who they fought, like in the original story. Gray fights against his father and he obtains the ice devil slaying magic. So now he's a true ice wizard, um, ice demon slaying magic, and ice dragon slaying magic. He's all three. He's the best ice wizard in the series. He can't be beat, essentially. Like, he's even above Natsu right now. He can freeze fire and shit. Whatever fire that Natsu has, unless Natsu uses the lightning flame dragon mode, he ain't beating Gray. They approach Margear and they fight against Margear. Margear is getting his ass whooped by Gray. And then Gray's looking for the E&D book, and Natsu's been told by Igneo to obtain the book at any cost. Don't let it fall into the wrong hands. Don't let it burn and don't open it. And he's like, oh shit, Gray's about to take it. And then Natsu and Gray kind of have a little skirmish, but then Zeref appears. And then Gray tries to take out Zeref and the book. But the book disappears with Zeref. And then he's like, God damn, I was trying to do that. It was like the last thing I owed to my dad. And he's like, well, I owed it to my dad to protect that book, is what Natsu said, and not let it, end up in the wrong hands, but it still got away from me. Agnolia defeats, Igneo, and then the first generation Dragon Slayers all say goodbye to their dragons. And Gray doesn't understand it, and he's just like, whatever. And then the guild disbands for a while. He joins Avatar. When he joins Avatar, he doesn't get back with Urza or anybody. Everybody's getting like back together, right? And then Gray's basically heard about it through the grapevine, and he's like, I have to like strike them now. So he attacks them by himself. He takes out the Avatar Guild all by himself. They show up for the aftermath, and they're like, damn, Gray. Now then the battle god gets summoned by the old man, and he's like, Gray, you might have defeated the whole guild, but guess what? There's this thing. Can you handle that? And then, Natsu gets his time to shine with Urza, and they show off what they learned. They go to Caracal Island, everything like that happens the same way. Now, when Alvarez attacks Fairy Tail, oh my god, we got Natsu goes to fight Zeref. He fails to stop Zeref like in the original story. Gray's fighting against Jacob Lezo. He fights against Jacob Lezo and he beats him. Now we get to a part where, shit's getting shaky. Natsu, goes into a deep sleep and becomes E&D. Gray fights against Inbel, and Inbel is, not that powerful, but he kills, Juvia, or he thinks he kills Juvia. So then he just one-shots Inbel, basically kills him too. But Juvia, he thinks is dead, and he's like, I have to kill E&D. And he sees Natsu, and he's like, I guess I'm E&D. I don't even give a fuck, though, because I have to kill my brother. Where's Zeref? Where's Zeref at? That's why I was created. And he's like, well, I was created to defeat you. And they have a, fight that's ridiculous. And Gray's actually, putting belt ass on Natsu a little bit. Makarov still sacrifices himself. And he takes out a sizable amount of the forces with the fairy law technique. Then, Urza steps in and is like, you gotta stop. And he's like, okay, um, Gildarts fights against, August. Sting and Rogue fight against Larcade. God Serena didn't get cut down by Acnologia. So Gray fights against God Serena a little bit. And then Loxus steps in and fights, defeating him. Loxus does. Gray gets to the Guild Hall and he fights against Zera. And he's like, your magic has grown significantly. You've even surpassed E&D. He's like, you might be able to kill me. He's like, no, I'm going to kill you. Natsu won't even have to do anything. And then he's like, Natsu gets there and hits Gray. And he's like, you get the hell out of here. This is my fight. This is my brother. I have to beat him. Larcade shows up and, goddamn, Gray fights against Larcade. Larcade was still alive and shit. So, Gray fights against Larcade. Larcade tries to put Gray to sleep, and then, Gray fights through it and beats Larcade. Natsu and Gray defeat Zeref because Zeref was powerful and Natsu needed the help. Then they all got summoned to, Acnologia. Acnologia summoned all the Dragon Slayers, and Gray was summoned. And he's like, you became a Dragon Slayer late, and he still summoned you. And he's like, yeah. Natsu and Gray fight against Acnologia. Half of the Dragon Slayers give their power to Natsu, half of them give it to Gray. And then Gray and Natsu, defeat Acnologia. But the dragon's still over there and shit. So then Gray, hops back. They're like, why is the dragon still there? And then Gray cuts the head off of the dragon and shit and puts an end to Acnologia for good, because, like, that main body was in the, rift between time, but then the other body was still around. And they're like, God damn, we thought we beat him already. Is what Natsu said. And then Gray's like, don't worry about it. And he, handles that shit. One finishing attack, and he defeats Acnologia. Then, he becomes the most powerful wizard in Fairy Tail. Loxus gives him like a coat like this that he wears. He starts wearing a coat like Loxus. And he's like, you're a second generation dragon, so you gotta have one of these. You ain't like those guys who have cats. And then he's like, oh, thank you, Loxus. And he's just being cool on the side. Jubia, wants his dick and all that. And Gildarts is even praising him a little bit. Natsu's like, I'll surpass you one day. He's like, keep working, and Natsu's still a guy too. Don't get it fucked up. Natsu's still a guy. But Gray was the main character. 100 Years Quest. He starts, he fucks with Murphphobia a little bit. He fucks with these people. But that's the story of Gray Fullbuster, all right? If he was the MC, right? This man ended up having, after I became the, creator of the story, he ended up having Ice Make Magic, True Ice Make Magic, second generation Ice Giant Slaying Magic, and Ice Devil Slaying Magic. Powerful stuff right there, right? Be cool, call on the corner and let me know what you think about that in the comments. The alternate storyline of Gray Fullbuster being the MC of Fairy Tail.